Sister Marcia Hall and Sister Chala Marie Hill. Sister Marcia and Sister Chala are wonderful religious women who have consecrated themselves to religious life. All righty. So I think the Oblate Sisters of Providence are the eldest group in the room. Am I right, Sister Chala? The Oblates are older than the Handmaids?
Oh, yes.
All right, so we always gonna let the eldest go first. Tell us a little bit about the community, the uniqueness about the community.
Okay, so the Oblate Sisters of Providence were founded in 1829 by a woman of Haitian ancestry who was actually born in Cuba. So Elizabeth Lang came to the US in the early 1800s and settled in Baltimore around 1812 or so. Now, she was a woman of some means. Her father used to send her money. So she ran a school for the children of Haitian refugees out of her home with a friend of hers, Marie Ballas. Now, there's an idea, a misconception, I guess I should say, that it was illegal in Maryland to educate slave children, Black children. That wasn't the case. What was true was that the state was not providing education for children of color, and this is where Elizabeth stepped in to meet that need. She was a woman of vision, of courage, and a woman who met needs. So she physically met Father James Hector Nicholas Joubert in the spring of 1828. He came to her house because he was interested in establishing a school, and her spiritual director, Father Tessier, suggested that she would be the best person to talk to. So he went to her home and talked to Elizabeth and Marie, and in turn, they shared with him their desire to become women religious. He thought that was a splendid idea. He went to Archbishop Whitfield, who gave his permission for both the school and the religious community. So in June of 1828, the two of them, plus another woman, Rosine Vogue, established, at that time, it was called St. Francis. It wasn't called St. Francis, it was called the Oblate School for Colored Girls, but it's now called St. Francis Academy. So St. Francis Academy is 192 years old. It's the oldest continuously operating Catholic school for Black children in the United States. And then the following year, after their year of formation, the three of them, plus one of their students, Teresa Duchemin, made their promises to Father Joubert in their home on July 2nd, 1829. So we just celebrated our 191st anniversary this month. And I believe Sister Chala was there last year when we had our big celebration for 190 years.
Sister Marcia,
that's sort of the tour. Go ahead.
That's a beautiful history. Hold on 1 minute.
Sure.
Now, Sister Chala, you give us equally beautiful history about your community that was also founded by a woman of color.
Okay, so our community, the Handmaids of Mary, I'll say the Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary, was actually founded in 1916. And we were founded by Father Ignatius Listener, an SMA father who was actually considered the apostle of Negroes. And he was down in Savannah, Georgia. He had erected some schools and churches, and he actually had Franciscan missionaries of the Immaculate Conception who were ministering in his schools. And he happened to come to become aware that there was proposed legislation that would have outlawed whites from teaching at the time colors.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very concerned, what would he do with these schools? He would not have any teachers to serve. So he did, because he had been around and working with Blacks, he approached the Holy Family Sisters, and they had no one to send. And he also approached the Oblates. and they also had no one to send. But in the back of his mind, Ignatius Listener had always been the desire to have a Black congregation. He felt that it was important and that Blacks brought a lot to religious life. So he began thinking, how can I do this, knowing what was going to happen? At the same time, our mother Theodore, who was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and went to school there, a devout Catholic family. At the age of 19, she joined what was then the Franciscans, the Colored Franciscan Sisters. And she was actually a member of that congregation for more than 25 years. The congregation minister, I'll say the Superior General, was deceased, and the bishop came along. It must have been about 6 sisters left, and disbanded the congregation. She wanted to remain a religious, and they were told that they could approach other religious congregations. Well, she did approach the Oblates, and many times you'll hear that she came out of the Oblates, or hear different things about what happened, or that she came out of the Sisters of the Holy Family. But actually there was a group of sisters from the Holy Family Sisters who in turn founded those Colored Sisters of St. Francis, which she in turn joined at a later date. But she was accepted by the Oblates and was there actually for 2 years as a novice, but that relationship did not continue. And after that, she found a job working in Trinity College. She was working as a receptionist, and the same as I hear with Mother Lang, it was her spiritual director who introduced her to Ignatius, Father Ignatius Listener, who was looking for a co-founder. She had always wanted to continue in religious life, and actually her name, Mary Theodore, was the name that was given her in the Oblates when she received her habit. So she and Father Ignatius Listener came to meet each other. He thought that she would be a good candidate, but she was strong-willed. I say yes, she was strong-willed because she had been a religious for over 20 years, but in transferring, she was put back to what we still do today many times in congregations, put back to the initial stages of becoming a religious. So with her being strong-willed and having a heart turned towards God, and her prayer always was, Lord, what would you have me to do? When she heard about this venture, she was overjoyed and felt, okay, this is how I can resume my life as a religious. And it was actually October 16th in 2016 that she put on her habit, which she had literally kept, and she again renewed her vows as a religious woman. And she had a couple of other women who joined her with that, who were able to begin their religious life. So I guess
those are two extraordinary, phenomenal stories. I just love hearing them. I can't hear those stories enough. I want to thank both of y'all for that beautiful history. Sister, while we have you already speaking, Sister Chala, tell us, you have a lot of uniqueness about you as a religious woman. 2 questions. The first one being, what drew you to religious life based on your personal history? And then what has kept you in a church that has not, and I'm talking about church, the hierarchy, the brick and mortar, that has not always been so kind to you. So what drew you and what kept you?
What drew me? Well, I'm a cradle Catholic. Grew up right across the street, one-way traffic from the church. So my life was the church, particularly up until when I went off to high school. High school became another, something different in my life, let's say. I got to take a train and meet other people. And so my life did take a little different way of being for a while. And as people say, sometimes this drove me away from the church or this, none of that happened. And somehow I just seemed to flow away from the church, maybe you could say. Not coming towards, but flowing away. But if anybody ever asked me who was I or what was I always told them I was Catholic. I knew my Baltimore catechism and had a love of God that was in my heart, although many times I may not have showed it by the fact that I wasn't part of a religious congregation, part of a Catholic congregation. I wasn't doing the things that one would do. I wound up getting married, having children. I was widowed after 16 years with children. And it was about that time that I began, I'll say, praying more, and eventually began returning to church. And when I came back, I was, if you ever heard about a revert, you know, you hear about converts, it's one thing, but a revert is even more than a convert, because at that point when I came back, I resurrected all that I had known, because even as a child, I did my 9 first Fridays, I did my first Saturdays, I sang in the choir, I was a sacristan, I did all of those things, and it all came back, I would almost say with a vengeance, when it did happen, and I became very involved with the church and the church's teachings. And that's what it, some point in time, something in, if I could show my heart, in my heart, something there began saying, you can be a religious. And I kept saying, no, I cannot. The interesting thing about that was that people began asking me, because anytime it came up in my heart, I would say, I'm too old. And then people began asking me or saying things to me. And I say that to say, Baptist deacon came through my office one day and he says, I don't know why you haven't joined the convent. And he just went out. And actually when these things was happening, it was like my head would buzz, because in somewhere in what I knew I was feeling and thinking, I knew that there was some truth to it. So that I wasn't only hearing this from Catholics, I was hearing this from non-Catholics. And one day, 3 people said it to me at 3 different places, and then the 3rd person said it to me. I said to her, you know, you're the 3rd person this day that said it to me. And she says, well, you need to look at that. But it was very interesting. People would say, whatever they would say, and I always would say, I'm too old, and they would say, no, you're not. And so I began looking at religious life, living in New York. I knew the Franciscan Handmaids and joined. So despite what was happening, and even as a child, I knew that the Catholic Church was not, or people in the Catholic Church was not always kind to Black people. I learned that as a brownie in St. Patrick's Cathedral, when we would have Girl Scout Sunday, and no matter what time we got to the cathedral, we sat in the back. And I remember our, the Girl Scout leader saying that we would not return there again, because particularly one day we got there so early, the previous mass was still on, they had us in the back, and then they sent people in and had us in the back. And so I knew from an early point that there were times that the church was not kind to us, that the church was not accepting of us. But I also knew that God loved me and I was responding to his love. And so that's what brought me into religious life. And that's what's kept me in religious life.
Sister Marcia, same question for you.
So what brought me to religious life? I too am a cradle Catholic, but my parents were not. My father, I guess he started hanging, there was only one Black Catholic church in Trenton, New Jersey. And he started hanging around as a middle schooler. and somehow became a convert. My mother did not convert until after she'd had my brother, who was younger than myself. So, but they insisted on sending us to Catholic school, Catholic elementary and high school. And in that way, I've come to understand that they created a culture of vocations, not intentionally. But what I mean by that is that whoever was pastor, Oblate Sisters, because I'm an Oblate girl. I was taught by the Oblates kindergarten to 8th grade. And they were always welcome in our home and always came to our home, barbecues, picnics, parties, whatever. So where nowadays people say, oh, my children have not been educated by sisters, or they think that religious life is strange. It wasn't strange. I mean, it wasn't anything necessarily that called to me at that time, but it didn't seem odd or strange because I was around the sisters. So I guess fast forward to graduate school, I was in my 30s, mid-late 20s, early 30s, having a rough time in a PhD program. And it was the Feast of the Assumption, excuse me. It was the Feast of the Assumption, August 15th, and I went to Mass. And at some point during that Mass, I had a vision of myself in an oblate habit, and that's the only way I can describe it. I saw myself in what was a traditional oblate habit, and I said, I don't think so. And kept on doing what I was doing, which was floundering, but eventually finishing the program, going off to take teaching positions. And I found myself in Boston and not happy as an assistant professor of sociology. So I worked in a summer program with children. And I decided, okay, I had heard this call earlier and I had ignored it and I was unhappy. So let's start to unpack this. So then I decided, okay, I needed to move to Baltimore to be closer to the Oblates, which I did. And eventually, over time, decided I would enter the community. And I tell people I was a slow learner because it took me about 11 years to say my yes. So what's kept me here? I think Sister Chala would say the same thing. Most religious would say the same thing. What is it that is most appealing about religious life? And you say community. And then you say, well, what's the hardest thing about religious life? And you say community. So community both attracts and repels. I remember when I was an assistant principal at a girls' high school here, and I was the only oblate on staff. There were other sisters, but I was the only oblate, therefore the only Black sister in the building. And there were some rough days. And I would come home, and every day that God sent that I came home from school, an older sister on my hall would say, how was your day? And that was important to me because prior to entering religious life, I had lived on my own for almost 20 years. So when I came in, there was no one saying, how was your day or anything like that. But she said that faithfully every day. So that's the beauty of community. Somebody that in many senses you've just met, you don't know that well. You wouldn't even necessarily call her a friend, but who asks about you. How are you doing? How are things going? So that's one of the things that's kept me in religious life, just that sense of community and what community can be.
Sister, I'm just having a good time, folks. I don't know if the rest of the church having as much fun as I'm having. But all right, so Sister Marcia, while we got you, tell us the various ways we can be supportive of you and the women in your community. Supported prayerfully, supported financially. Some of the things are obvious. And then tell us the not so obvious, if you can think of at least one, ways that we can support the gift that y'all are to the church.
I would say, well, the obvious thing is prayer, right? The obvious thing is prayer, and also opportunities for us to speak with, like today, but also maybe to come to Chicago and speak to the congregation at some point when we're past this pandemic. Speak to the young people in the congregation, which will promote vocations, because at least in our community, I am the last American vocation. The women behind me are all from Africa. So to talk about vocations as a viable, talk about religious life as a viable option for young women and young men, to promote the religious communities that are predominantly women of color. Those are the things that jump out at me. I would say, as a vocation director, which is one of the hats that I wear, we struggle to bring women here from Africa. So sponsoring somebody once they get here, because when they come, you know, they don't come with winter clothes and all the things that they need to stay here. So that's something very tangible that could happen. Promoting the cause of Mother Lang, talking about Mother Lang, talking about the Oblate Sisters, so that we become more front and center as opposed to off to the side. I mean, I guess that would be how I would describe it.
And Sister Chala Marie, what about you? What are some of the obvious things, and what is at least one thing that's not so obvious?
And again, as Sister Marcia said, first thing is prayer. Praying for vocations, praying for the people in your family, the younger people, and trying to have an environment that is Catholic, an environment that is aware of the fact that there are religious who are in the churches. There are African American religious, and talking about their lives, even knowing some feast days or other things, but talking about their lives. We have to begin rearing our young people in a Catholic environment and in an environment that talks about religious vocations. You know, we talk about vocations, but quite often we're not including religious or clerical life in those vocations any longer. So I think that's very important. And again, helping out, as Sister Marcia says, I also am the last African American vocation in my congregation. We have women behind us, all from Africa. Those who come, if they come in the winter, they don't even have a coat. You know, we can have something for them, but once they get here, again, they need coats, boots, shoes. They need all the things that we need here. They need thermal underwear, and a lot of it, because they feel the cold in a way that we don't. And one thing is in your parishes, wherever you are, when you see young people, ask them, have you ever thought of being a sister? Males, if you ever thought about becoming a priest or a deacon? But it comes from us. We also have to reach out and ask people those questions.
So at this point, with the beautiful contribution that both of you are making, I'm gonna give some space to the church so these church members can ask you questions, if you don't mind.
I have a question to a sister who was married and had children. So
And Sister Chala knew that was coming, Miss Ada. She knew, let me say, Sister Chala knew that was coming as soon as she told y'all she had been married and had some children. So buckle up, sister, because they ready for this ride, baby. They not shy at all. You go ahead, Miss Ada. I love you, Ada.
Okay, sister. So what was that like for you and for your children when you decided to become religious?
It was difficult. It was challenging at times. The day that I became a novice, when they put the veil on my head, my eldest daughter cried for about half an hour. One of the things that she said is a friend of hers had asked her, what made your mother think that you were old enough to let her go? And she was old enough to let me go. But it was for them, I was the matriarch. All of the dinners, and you know how we have dinners, all of that was held at my house. And so for my children, it was very difficult because there was no more going to Ma's house. There was no more, even when you go see Ma, opening up the refrigerator to get something.
Yeah.
You know, the things that you do when you come to see Ma. Well, when you come to a convent to see Ma, it's a very different, however, they've grown into my being a religious.
Right.
So even sometimes when they go places and they have maybe a difficulty or something, they say, I sure wish Mom was here because if she comes here with the habit, things would be different. So they've, so they've grown into the fact that this is who I am. And grown into the fact that I'm still their mother, that I still love them, but then that I'm answering God's call in a different way. And so this is why I'm living my life as I am now.
Thank you, sister.
There are some people who say, oh, that must have been wonderful for your children. And I look at them and say, no, it's not. Actually, my granddaughter was 5 and only have 1. And we had rituals. Matter of fact, as she was growing up, I used to tell her when I'd give her a bath and put lotion on her skin. And I would tell her, now when grandma gets old, you have to remember, you have to get a house that has a, where you could roll my wheelchair right in. I'm going to live with you. And this is what I want you, same way I'm doing this for you, this is what I want you to do for me. And so the last time I had her for an overnight, waiting for my date to come in, to have that ritual with her and knowing that I would never get to do that again was something that was bittersweet. That's the only way I could say it was bittersweet, because I knew then that I would never have that opportunity again. But when God calls, we answer.
And we answer, right.
When God calls, we answer. The only thing, the worst thing of not answering is I kept saying, I don't know how I could not do this. And I would say it and say, use those words. And it was very interesting because I've heard other people use that same language when they said it. And I know it wasn't something that we read someplace. It was something that we were feeling.
Sister Marcia, our next question is from you. It comes from the chat box. And folks in the chat box want to know, what's your community's charism?
We'll try that again. We are educators, and we also believe in God's providence. We believe that God has provided, does provide, and will provide. That's why we're called the Oblate Sisters of Providence. But in terms of our mission and ministries, we have always been educators.
Sister Chala, what's your charism as a handmaid?
Okay, I would say being social justice and pastoral care. We started out as, of course, educators, but very early on, we began doing many other things. Running soup kitchens and visiting the sick and nursing and just so many other areas, and that has continued on till today. But so if you ask, we would say our charism is social justice and pastoral care. And even with social justice, being aware of racism and being bridges. One thing we consider ourselves bridges between Blacks and whites, helping people to understand that we are with them all and God is with them all.
Sister Chala and Marie, this is Claire. I would like to ask both of you, have both of you been successful at recruitment and getting youth and adults into the religious life, and do they stay and keep on after, if you've had any success with that?
When I was doing vocation work, the prognosis of many vocation outreaches is dismal. That's the term I would like to use. And even in our archdiocese, they've now disbanded the vocation office, so they're only looking for priests. But we had, the vocation ministers came together, and we had many affairs. We would try to do things, and the young women who participated, and sometimes it would be 1, 2, or most likely it was none. And we've done that. I've also done that with a couple of congregations. We've done that up in the Harlem area, and the same thing. I remember one time, the 3 women came, and one wasn't Catholic, one wanted to see what was happening, the other one is still raising children.
Thank you.
And Sister Marcia?
Yeah, I think I can echo. I've been vocation director for 11 years. And we no longer have what they call come and see events. These are standard vocation events where you invite young women to come and see what your community is about. We stopped doing that because the last few times we've done it, people would say they were coming, and then at the last minute they would say, we're not coming. The new administration asked us to have one, so we did about 2 years ago. And I can tell you, I contacted 6 of the local colleges and universities and about 35 different parishes. One woman called me who was an alum of one of our schools, and so she really wanted to connect with the sisters that she knew. But we ended up not having it. This was 2 years ago because no one expressed an interest in coming. It's been very challenging and disappointing to plan events and people don't come.
Yes.
So a lot of my energy and the African vocations were not vocations that I sought. They sought us out. So they came to the website. Maybe they were referred by a priest. So in my time, I think 7 or 8 women, maybe 9 have come in during my time as vocation director, and about 4 or 5 of them are left. You know, as vocation director, you don't expect everybody to stay. Some people think they are called, and then they come and realize, nope, this is not the life for me. So, you know, I'm still vocation director, still on the hunt, I guess you might say. But that situation needs lots and lots of prayer. I go back to what Sister Chala said about, actually it wasn't Sister Chala, I'm sorry, I can't remember whether it was Claire or who spoke about talking to the parents, because you're right, parents often openly discourage their children from pursuing religious vocation. I attended a workshop in Chicago, and that year they had the parents of people who had joined religious life on a panel. And I remember one mother saying that when people used to congratulate her for her son being a priest, she was not crying tears of joy. But she had grown into that. She had come to accept that. She never actively discouraged him, but she wasn't encouraging. And I firmly believe that we need to have something like that for our community. I've been trying to raise the money for a video in which we get young religious and their parents to talk about the journey together, to get rid of some of the misconceptions people have, to see that, yes, there are still young African Americans who are entering religious life, entering the priesthood, and that they find it a viable life, and their parents have come to accept that and encourage them and are proud of them. So it's difficult is probably the best thing I can say. It's difficult.
Thank you both. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Alex. I have a question for both of you. This is stemming from other conversations we had during this noon. Is there a focus on kind of trying to reach the adults? I know people have been talking about vocations for younger children, the youth, but it kind of seems in the conversations we had through these noon sessions, there's probably some kind of like Sister Hill, kind of like once they've kind of passed a certain age and they're kind of children, they have any children. Is there any focus, or what are your thoughts on focusing on kind of that group of people who are not necessarily young, but have kind of mature and past a certain age period?
I think it depends, for us, for the Oblate Sisters, I think it depends on the age itself. And to be quite honest, is a person physically capable of engaging in ministry? We have had older women contact us, but sometimes older women think that what we do is pray all day. So they look at us as sort of a retirement. This is their retirement option, that they're going to come here and pray all day. We have sisters in their 80s who are still very active. So is the person physically able to engage in ministry is really important. So it's not that we have not looked at, I don't think anybody would say, well, we have, our cutoff age is 30. No, but in any event, whether they're 30 or 50, have they been active in the church? Because believe it or not, I've had women contact me who are not active in the church. They're not a lector, they're not in the choir. This is just an idea they have, but they haven't shown by their actions that they understand what it would mean to be involved. So are they active in the church? And are they physically capable of being engaged in ministry? Those would be, I think, the most important things we would look at this time.
Thank you. And Sister Hill?
Yes, and I would ditto what Sister Marcia was saying, because when I would speak with people on the phone, that was one of my first things. Okay, so you want to be a sister? And usually I would just let them talk. And in the conversation, there's many times that that I heard life was not treating me well, so I thought it would be good to go into the convent. And when I heard that, that was right away for me a no-no. Life was treating me well, and I came into the convent. I had to retire from my job. The ministries that I was involved with, I had to terminate them. So I was active, I was doing things. When I hear people say, well, no, I don't do anything, because that's one of my questions. Well, what ministries are you involved in? And if they weren't involved with any ministries, I would tell them, if you think you'd like to do this, get yourself a spiritual director, see what ministries you would like to do in the church. And while we talk, let's see how you feel about those ministries. And if you're not working, find yourself a job, because when you come in as a candidate, you're going to have to support yourself. And I came in as a candidate. I was part of, through the Religious Formation Conference, they have, in certain areas, they have programs for candidates and programs for novices. Well, I was a member of the candidacy program. And I remember thinking, when we had an icebreaker, one of the questions with the icebreaker is, who is the grandmother? Well, I became furious. I felt that my confidentiality had been uprooted. And if I wanted to tell people I was going to be grandmother, then that would be for me to tell people. Well, what happened is there were 3 grandmothers there. And one woman who was our age, who had never been married, so she wasn't, but she was a catechetical director. And actually, all of us, because we call each other our band in different congregations, we are still friends, and we are all still in ministry in our various congregations. But I certainly, anybody, and the interesting thing is, except for one woman who was out of the Philadelphia area, when we called the vocation office, we were all told that we were too old. And I remember years later something happening when I was doing vocation work, and I inquired, were they still telling people they were too old? Because they were looking for the 20-something person who was just coming out of college. And I've been in religious life now for 18 years. Well, and I've been in ministry for all that time. So that was the other thing, is that people were saying to people, you're too old.
I wanted to know from both our sisters how the community life has changed, and what made it change for you. I remember Sister Hill saying that this candidate that she had mentioned before, she had mentioned that she should, if she wasn't working, that she should probably just get a job to support herself. And I was wondering if all the sisters had jobs in which they had to support themselves.
So Vera, the question is the community life, how has it changed?
Yes.
And they using the example perhaps of jobs where a candidate has to have a job and a novice is not allowed to have a job.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah. So let's hear from Sister Chala first, and then Sister Marcia.
Okay, thank you, Father.
Okay, and actually, because I was in the New York area, I continued my job until I resigned to become a novice. However, as a candidate in our congregation, candidates are self-supporting. So that's why I was letting anyone know who didn't have a job, or that they would have to be able to work at least part-time to support themselves. That they would have to be paying something into room and board into the congregation, and they would need to have health insurance. They would need pocket money and all of those things. It becomes a little different if you have sisters from who are coming in from outside of the country. You know, you have to make some type of accommodations for them. But people who are here, particularly if I'm hearing, you know, life is difficult, so I think I'll come into the convent. Well, okay, let's get you. Yeah, that's actually not the way it's going to work.
Not a good
But me, I always look at it pre-Vatican II and after Vatican II, because I hear the pre-Vatican II stories, and after Vatican II, it's a little different. However, our congregation makes attempts to, where we have our community meetings, where we come together for morning and evening prayer for those who are home for meals, that we eat together. So we make those type of, that's part of our horarium, those things that we do. And then there's other times that we come together to do some things in community. However, depending on which a ministry is, so when everybody taught school, was teaching in school, then it was a lot easier to have that community time.
Right.
But depending on what your ministry is, you might miss dinner for 3 or 4 days a week when you come in. You have to do something else, but that's because of your ministerial obligations. But community community, as I say, can be a blessing or a curse, depending.
Absolutely.
And for me, if I see it being a curse, then I have to look at myself. Then how can I help make this a blessing?
Yes. Thank you.
And Sister Marcia, what's your take on the question?
Well, I do hear the Vatican II story, pre-Vatican II stories. But I entered at 42. And so for me, I would say how community life has changed. Community life changes as people age. So since our community is top heavy in women who are between the ages of 70 to 100, the older the sisters get, the less inclined they are for community activities. What I mean by that is when you're in formation, you have recreation with your formation director every night. And then when you cross over and become a junior sister and move into a mission, that's not necessarily the case, because the sisters are, they're tired. After dinner, they're ready to go to bed. So I'd say there's generational issues there in terms of community life and age issues. So as one of my other hats is I'm coordinator of the Mother House. And so I tried to encourage more activities, more social activities among the sisters. And there was some pushback because the older sisters are saying, well, by that time, by 7, 8 o'clock, I'm beat, I'm tired. All I want to do is go in my room and put my feet up. So I'd say that's one way where I've seen change. In terms of our horarium, yes, we have Mass every day, and we've been blessed because even throughout the pandemic, we've had Mass every day. And we have evening prayer 5 days a week. During the pandemic, we added to, we included the weekends. So we are still in prayer together. We still have meals together. Those are things that happen. And I'm trying to remember now, what was the other part of the question?
Second part, I think you covered it. I think you did a good job.
Women who come into either of these orders, are they assigned, or do they get a chance to say, this is the ministry that I'd like to do, or this is the job that I want to work at, or is that, they have to get permission to do that or not?
There are conversations throughout their formation as to what ministry they'd like to take on. And then when they become junior sisters, they actually start, in their apostolic novitiate, start to do, they might take on a ministry, and then those conversations continue because sometimes they want to go to school. But it's not an assignment per se, not like it used to be. It's not like, well, you're being sent here or there. It's more, what is it that you'd like to do, and can the community accommodate that?
That's how it happens in our congregation. It's the discussions about a sister's interests, what she would like to do, and what is available for her to do. Many times it's based on what her skills and talents are, or what she may need further education in order to pursue.
I have a question to ask of both of the sisters who are with us. Your orders, do they have any programs geared toward the laity, to involve laity in the work, the ministries that you're doing, so that maybe individuals can respond to a certain calling, could then obtain more information, more experience, and eventually may be called to join the nun?
So I know with us, we have associate programs, and people call and say that they were thinking about us. They were wondering were there any volunteer positions available, and we meet with them and talk with them and see how best we can meet their needs, and the relationship goes on from there. But laity certainly are invited to join us in ministry in whatever way it's possible.
Okay, I asked that question really from the perspective of a retired person. And I know I have received outreach from groups such as the Ignatius Volunteers to come together, to pray together, to do things. Those persons probably will not enter into religious life, but they could definitely impact others. And they can do what I found through my years of experience that is really lacking within the Black Catholic Church. And that is knowledge of our history. The things that you were sharing with us today, as far as your founders, etc. I know of a group that we didn't know and didn't have that information until we read and reviewed Father Cyprian Davis's book. And then eyes were opened when they realized that we have this rich history and how many people in our church pews that we somewhat just look over or what have you, like our Haitian communities and our African communities in our churches. People gained a better appreciation, knowledge, and understanding of our rich togetherness and history.
Yes, that's quite true. And with our congregations, it's something many times that needs to be done.
Thank you.
In some way, that the congregants had the opportunity to look at our church history, particularly our Black church history.
Yes.
Because many times it's not acknowledged unless you have a Black priest.
So my question is, I know with different orders, I have some friends who joined other orders. I'm talking about males, and their issue, kind of experiencing racism, kind of hindered them from continuing their paths. Do any people joining your orders, question to both of you, face what are their challenges they face? Kind of seeing through the entire kind of a decision.
I think they face the challenges that most entrants into religious congregation face. There's just what we go through the process of formation to begin being able to live religious life. We feel the calling, but then we have to come to terms with who we are and become aware of what we may be bringing into situations. So as a Franciscan, we say conversion. I'm third order Franciscan, so conversion lasts for the rest of our life. I'm constantly turning more towards God. But that turning, and particularly as a newer person in the time of formation, means that I have to let go of some things. And some of that goes across whatever religious congregation order you are going in. Some of those things we all have to go through. So that someone coming into our congregation may not experience racism as they were if they were going into a predominantly white congregation. But the other things they're still going to have to go through.
I agree that there are certain things that happen regardless of what congregation you're in. We profess these vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. And the hardest vow, I think most people would say, is obedience, is learning to let go and let God and follow what God's will is for you and not what your will is for you. So I think that living into those vows is probably one of the more difficult things that we do. I would say in this day and age, one of the other challenges is if you are a woman who is in her 30s or 40s who's entering religious life, And that's the age range of the women who are coming into our congregation. Most of the women that you're going to have contact with in the community, as I said, are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. So there's quite an age gap. And so for those young women, a lot of responsibility falls on them early. They're asked to do things earlier, and they have more responsibilities earlier. As someone who is 62, I wear about 5 different hats in the congregation. So so that can be a challenge.
Well, Sister Chala and Sister Marcia, I certainly want to thank you for being here at St. Benedict today. This was more than interesting. I think on some levels, as I'm listening to some of the comments and thinking about things that have been said prior to today, it's a bit inspiring as well. We've been bouncing, I have been bouncing an idea around with a few people at the parish as well as across the country about capturing legacy. And just when each of you told your personal story of how you got to where you are, it became more clear to me, because I've not met Sister Marcia. I've met Sister Chala, but it was quite some time back. I think that was like early 90s. So, but because we've had so few African American vocations in the Catholic Church, and now because we don't have younger people following in any measurable numbers, just, there's a trickling. It seems to me that it's very important to capture the stories of each individual, and then to let that be a part of the witness, because I really am afraid that if we don't do that, that's not going to be done, and it almost feels like history will march on, and in short order, there might be people who never knew that we were here. But it's hearing your story. I think it's very important that we capture that. So we look forward to hearing more about that in the future. We're looking at organizing an effort to get the stories of the religious, so that we can give people their flowers while they're with us, and that we can document the narrative that will tell the story of the future. So thank you.